when you look at that now, does everything come flooding back, or is it like watching somebody else?
Somewhere in between. I mean, the first thing is I'm surprised, if I may say this, how good it is. I was expecting bits of it to be good, and then I was expecting sort of longueurs and bits that obviously didn't work. And I'm really very surprised. It seems to me remarkably funny, much funnier than I really remember it being at the time. And I'm also struck by how much closer it is to Python than I'd really ever realized. I thought there were one or two things that were going to be vaguely Pythonic, but even little things like Amy MacDonald saying, "And now for something completely different," or the last 1948 show, that epic lettering that we always used on Python. We were already, so I'm really surprised, pleasantly surprised by how much like Python it is.
One of the things is, it was really nice to have Keith Martin out earlier, one of the original Associated Rediffusion announcers. And I think Keith never really took himself too seriously. But I think one of the things that mark out 48 show and later Python is the way that you toy with the conventions of television, like the continuity announcers. Was that something that you just thought at the time was innately funny?
Yeah, because we were very bored with the conventions. And we'd all worked together. This includes all the Pythons on David Frost's show, The Frost Report, both in 66 and 67. We did 13 episodes doing subjects like the armed forces or education or health or something like that. So it was vaguely satirical, but not politically satirical. And we were very tired, all of us, and this might surprise people, with the satire boom, which had started in 62, when the funniest show I've ever seen in my life, Beyond the Fringe, Peter Cook, Dudley Moore, Jonathan Miller and Alan Bennett, came to Cambridge. And a friend of mine I was sharing digs with had a ticket for the matinee, and I went along and saw this gloriously funny thing, which then went on to London, and within just a few weeks had caused a sensation, but much more just in metropolitan London. And then 3 or 4 months later, the BBC did political satire for the first time nationwide, hosted, of course, by David Frost. And suddenly the whole atmosphere changed and went from a very deferential English culture, where I remember seeing a reporter saying to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, asking him about what was going to be in the budget, and behaving really like a head boy interviewing the headmaster. You know what I mean? That kind of extraordinary deference. And the first time Peter Cook impersonated Harold Milson, Harold Macmillan. There was an extraordinary experience for people who were there, because we hadn't seen a prime minister made fun of before. I know it's extraordinary to say that now to young people, but it would have been considered disrespectful. And when Peter Cook stood there and said, because Macmillan was this very patrician guy, and Peter just made him look like a doddering old fool. Said, traveling the world on your behalf, I was in Germany meeting the Chancellor here and there. And this just hadn't been done before. And when Alan Bennett got up and did the sermon, did a parody of a Church of England sermon, I've never heard laughter like it, because it was the laughter of liberation. It wasn't just that it was funny, it was just, we'll never have to listen to this clothian rubbish again. Of course we did, changed nothing, because comedy, but the sense of release was extraordinary. Then David went on with that, and then there was nothing but satire. And about 4 years later, by the time we got to 66, people were sick and tired of satire. They didn't want it anymore. So although the Frost Report was ever so slightly socially satirical, it wasn't politically satirical. And that's where we all sat around the tables. There was Dick Vosborough, who was doing the opening announcement with those silly clips of film. Barry Cryer, who helped us with all sorts of waste parts and writing the 48 show. And then Michael Palin and Terry Jones and Eric Idle, they were all part of that team. And Tony Jay, who went on to write Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister, he wrote the theme script, and most surprising of all was the script editor, who was Marty Feldman. Marty was not a performer. He told me, when I asked him if he'd be in the 48 show, he said the last time he'd done any performing in public had been on either Margate or Clacton Pier, I can't remember which, and at the age of 15 he'd been firing arrows without metal points into the stomach of an Indian fakir. That was his one and only experience of performing in public. And so what happened was that David, who totally nurtured my career, got to the point when he said to me, would you like to do a show of your own? And I was sort of went, ooh, you know, I'm a bit scared and all that, because I had terrible nerves in those days. And he said, no, seriously, it'll be a late night thing and a bit experimental, and, you know, it's not going to kill your career dead in its tracks if some of it doesn't work. So he said something similar to Tim. We decided we wanted to do a show together, not separate shows. Then we immediately said to David, well, we want Graham Chapman. And then the surprise to David was when we said we wanted Marty Feldman, because I can remember him just looking blank and saying, but Marty's not a performer. And we said, no, but I said he's going to be wonderful. I just know he's going to be a great performer because he goes into these wonderful characters. East End barrow boy or a Hollywood film producer, and he's going to be terrific. I remember David said to me, but what about the way he looks? It's fascinating, wasn't it? He really thought that was going to be a disadvantage. So when we got together to... Well, nobody knows anything. You know William Goldman's book about, Adventures in the Screen Trade. Nobody ever knows anything in advance. They can never get it right, but except I think I claim I got Marty right. And that was the very first show that we did together, and I'm surprised how much of it works. It looks almost as though it's been edited, you know, with the weaker bits taken out. But I have to tell you, a lot of it you will recognize. For example, Gray's wonderful wrestling, which I think he almost does better than he does at on the tape of Python at the Hollywood Bowl. That was a sketch that was done while I was at Cambridge by a fellow, I remembered his name the other day, I forgot it now, and Graham bought the sketch off him and then made it his own. And then that, as you know, finished up in the Python stage shows. And there were other, the Secret Service sketch, that was something that was in the 63 Footlights Review that got us all into show business. That was the one that Michael White took to London, our little student review. So I'm giving you just lots of information because I know the nice thing about this audience is I know you're kind of interested in this stuff.
Yeah. Well, of course, famously, the Four Yorkshiremen sketch you used recently to start off the live shows, didn't you?
That's right. And originally Tim and Marty wrote a version of it, and I recognized it because I was a great fan of Stephen Leacock. Now, Spike Milligan had put me on to Stephen Leacock, who, the most extraordinary, he was a university lecturer in, I think at McGill University in Canada, and I think he lectured on something like economics. And he was very well known throughout the English-speaking world as one of the great humorists of the time. This is about 1900. And he had written a sketch like that, which I'd remembered. So Marty and Tim produced it. And what Gray and I were good at was building sketches, you know, in the same way that we built What Have the Romans Ever Done for Us, which was very funny as a first draft, but needed more structuring. And Gray and I did that. We did it in the 48 show, but we never did it in Python until we did it on stage.
I think the thing with the 48 show, in retrospect, it must have been very liberating because you were allowed to be zany. You were allowed to do the stuff that perhaps they wouldn't have thought appropriate for the Frost Report because obviously they were worried about appealing to a wider audience.
That's exactly right, Dick. And we used to do these. We used to come up, the Pythons and Dick Vosper and Barry Cryer and others, we would come up with crazy ideas, and all the writers would roar with laughter at the table. And dear Jimmy Gilbert, one of the nicest men I ever met, and very, very, what's the word? Competent almost sounds degrading, but you know what? He just did everything beautifully well, and his judgment was excellent. Jimmy would say, sorry guys, I agree it's funny, but they won't get it in Bradford. And that was always the phrase. And when we started doing this 48 show, we didn't know if enough people, we knew that not everyone in Bradford would get it, but we were taking a little bit of a bet that enough people would get it.
Well, the show was very popular, wasn't it? It showed I think in the London area, it was sort of in the top 10 for all the shows watched in that area, even though it went out very late at night.
I should have done my homework on this, because when I started including this in the book, we only had 5 shows, and those 5 shows had been discovered in a vault in Swedish television, and they were 5 shows that had been compiled by the Swedes from all the shows. They'd chosen stuff for 5 shows that were just shown in television in Sweden, and most of the stuff had been wiped, because you know what happened at one point. Those old tapes that were about that big and that big and that, 13 of those, a series of those, took up a lot of shelf space, and they were always trying to save space and also to reuse the tapes. So they got all wiped by a guy called George Brightwell at the Frost organization. May God rot his soul. And it's extraordinary to think there were 13 programs with Marty, Graham, me, and Tim Rook-Taylor, and they just wiped them. They wiped, some of you guys know all this stuff, they wiped Alan Bennett's wonderful series on the March.
Yep.
And so to start discovering these now was very exciting. I was very happy about those. Then last year, Marty's widow, Loretta, died and left me 2 shows. I'm not so sure if she quite knew what they are, but she left these 2 tapes to me because they were in her attic, and somehow Marty had got hold of them. That's 2 other ones. And then Wilfrid Frost, who's David's second son and my godson, I'm proud to say, discovered 2 more of them. The first, this one, and the one we're going to show you in a moment, in the vaults somewhere, the Frost organization.
Yeah, he brought them in for us to look at on a Steenbeck, and I was trying desperately to hide my excitement. I thought, well, if what it says on the can is in the can, then we've found a couple of treats here.
Yeah. And I'm hoping we could put them all together, because there are other bits of them out there. For example, one of the best sketches I've ever done was with Rowan Atkinson, and it's called The Beekeeper. And if you go on YouTube, we did it at an Amnesty show, but it was actually a sketch originally done, the 48 show with Marty Feldman. And we also, at an Amnesty show, I used to raid all the old material when I was putting those shows together, and there's a top of the form that we did that actually we now exist, because it now exists because it's in the Swedish thing. And there's a lot of material out there. Oh, the bookshop sketch, do you know that one? Where
Charles Dickens with 2 Ks.
With 2 Ks, the well-known Dutch author. Yes, that's right. Which I did with Connie Booth in an Amnesty show too. So there's some really fine material out there. I would go so far as to say I don't think Terry Jones would agree with me, but material as funny as anything we did in Python. And it would be lovely to put it together. And my old PA, who was my PA for 5 years in Santa Barbara, he's actually trying to collate it all together, because he's wonderful at raiding the internet, and he'll find 30 seconds of something or even a little bit of text. So slowly we're putting it all together, and I'm hoping at some point it would be wonderful if we could do a whole day on.
Well, we are, as I say, we are planning to do something with all the material we can get hold of, and hopefully next year. There was a time when the only way you could hear the sketches was by the album. They released an album, and I remember learning them because you listened to them. And one of the sketches on the album is the Thin Legs sketch.
Yes.
It was great to actually see visuals to that, because I've just had it as an audio joke.
Well, I remember it vaguely, and it is much better than I thought it was. Because sometimes you remember things as being okay, but that seemed to me to be really consistently good. Because the trouble with most comedy is it's patchy, so it's very unusual to see a longer sketch that kind of works continuously the whole way through.
I think there are moments in the 1948 show when you are experimenting with ideas that perhaps don't come off as well, but the ones that do work, and the ones that, as you say, foreshadow Python, they seem to have aged much better, because that form of zaniness just doesn't seem.
We used to do slightly mimey sketches, which went to. There was quite a nice one about 2 policemen pursuing a burglar into a library, but no one was allowed to speak or make a noise. And it was quite sweet in its own way, but when I watched it recently, it looked very old-fashioned compared with this.